Sat in Manhattan, it's really interesting. My co-anchor in earlier shows, he actually does take an electric scooter sometimes into work and from the west side into our central office. But I'm limited. I'm just moved across the water. How am I to get in on a daily basis if it's not a car?
Well, listen, I think your options across the water are, well, you have a few, right? If you can take a car, you can take the train, which has been running the whole time. You could take any kind of micro-mobility option, whether it be a bike, a scooter, an e-bike, an e-scooter, in theory, over the bridge, depending where you're coming from. I wouldn't take one in the tunnel. But there are a bunch of ways to get here. Listen, what we're really concerned about, though, and why it's so important that we see more different options on the road is if all of a sudden we've got just the city full of single individuals in cars alone. We're going to have total gridlock. We're going to have Carmageddon here. And that's not what anyone wants to see in New York City.
How can legislation help for that? Because I entirely agree. I've been having to get a car in because we're deemed essential workers, so we come in here to the office. And we're seeing week by week the traffic starting to pick up, the queues starting to pick up, and I'm sure some of that well-earned cleaner air starting to be taken away from us once again. How do you see legislation being able to support cleaner roads at the moment?
Well, until just, I think, 2 weeks ago now, not even, maybe just a week, you couldn't have e-bikes and e-scooters in New York City. Now they're legal in 4 of the 5 boroughs. They're technically still not legal in Manhattan. Excuse me, I hope that changes soon. So we're really starting to see the government open up and think creatively about different ways to move New Yorkers around. And that's really important.
Yeah. And what about where else has been doing this well? While you take a breath and get your throat back. I'm interested in, we've seen Londoners, for example, really take to the sharing bicycles, but to me that still seems a slight concern in terms of pandemic having to get onto a shared use. But where have really opened up their roadways, ensured that perhaps we are starting to see cyclists claim the streets that little bit easier, and people have not to think about their safety to the same extent that they used to?
Yeah, well, you're seeing it all over Europe. European cities are doing a great job about making city streets cycle-friendly, pedestrian-friendly, recognizing that public transit, as we have thought about it for decades, is not going to look the same, at least in the near term. I hope it does again in the near future, but it's going to take a bit. So the European cities, London, they are thinking really creatively. Some U.S. cities are as well. San Francisco has been doing a lot with bikes and moving people around for a good amount of time, particularly cities who haven't had very reliable public transit are a little bit ahead of New York in some ways. We've relied on the subway and the bus system, which has worked great for so long and will again, I have no doubt. But we're facing, kind of a near-term situation where people aren't going to feel comfortable packing in the subways like they usually do, where most people's offices, particularly in the tech sector, the folks I work with, their offices are really centered in certain parts of Manhattan and Brooklyn. So what does it look like moving all those people around? What can we do as a city to get people back into their offices, to get them back supporting the neighborhoods where they work? So right now we're talking about transit, transportation, micromobility. I'm also really interested in thinking about basically opening more offices near where people live. So maybe you'd have satellite offices, distributed offices. You could go to work by your house, eliminate the long commute, but, get out of the house for a few minutes. I mean, you can see I have young kids. It's chaos. I would love to go to the office for a little bit, particularly with the short commute.
Yeah, I have to say, as much as I love my 2 kids, sometimes being able to come into the office is a delight. I'm interested in your view on how Tech NYC as well is seeing a resurgence of New York's own tech sector. How has technology filled the void that the pandemic has brought us? How is it thinking creatively about the ways in which we're going to work, whether it be from home, in satellite offices, in our big offices? Are we starting to see the startup culture of New York take on that challenge?
Yeah, we totally are. And I think about that, in 2 buckets, I guess, which you kind of alluded to. The first is that I'm going to speak in generalization for a second. This is obviously not true for every tech company, but tech companies have, by and large, really been weathering the crisis we face better than many other industries, right? And a big part of that is because it was so easy for these companies to transition to work from home. The technology largely kind of switched on seamlessly. So culturally, these companies have been able to, I mean, it's far from perfect and plenty of it had a lot to deal with, but really kind of navigate this time pretty well. And now what we're seeing is so many of them are thinking, as you said, creatively about how to help us in kind of the new world, if you will. We've seen a ton of this, obviously, in the health tech space.
Yeah.
Really excited about telehealth. We've got a bunch of New York companies leading on that front. Companies like Row and Capsule and Maven Health, City Block, Umbrella, these companies who've been thinking about delivering healthcare and pieces of the healthcare system using technology for a long time. And all of a sudden, here we are, right? And it's as if someone turned on a switch, and all of a sudden, America and the rest of the world is ready for digital delivery of healthcare wherever possible. Super bullish on that. Really excited about what we see in the ed tech space, which I think is so interesting. Any parent obviously will agree with me on this. One of the things I think is really interesting in this particular instance is, I think for many of us, myself personally, while technology is amazing at connecting people, we've also seen some of the limits of technology. It's not a substitute for schools. I don't think anyone who has kids right now thinks that, Zoom or Google Meet is going to take the place of in-person education. So I'm really glad that as a society, here in New York especially, we're really kind of confronting those issues head on and thinking about them.